Welcome, Kevin, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm delighted to have you as my guest today. Do you want to give people a little bit of a flavour of your background and how you got into what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. I got into what I'm doing because about a little bit over a decade ago, I found myself working as a headhunter, a recruiter for Google. And at the time, it was considered one of the best places to work according to all the workplace lists. And I expected that people would be walking around in a state of perpetual bliss. But that wasn't the case. There was still a high degree of variance in terms of how happy people were at work and how engaged people were in their job. So that really led me to want to understand employee engagement, employee experience, and employee happiness. And I studied organizational psychology with one of the co-founders of positive psychology. And since then, I've been on a journey. I'm a recovering consultant, so I worked with the Gallup organization and Deloitte, and now I work in tech as an employee experience scientist with Qualtrics. And my role is to help organizations identify and close gaps in the employee experience to help them
Mm.
get from where they are to where they want to be.
Yeah. It's. I think that's a really nice synopsis, and it sounds. I don't know the word to use. It's like it sounds like a really noble profession, and it sounds exactly what you're doing is creating happier working environments so that employees can thrive, so that their experience at work is a positive one.
It's very fulfilling, especially when you can point out that to organizations and to leaders that doing good by people is also good business.
Yeah. Maybe we can start there because I've had a few conversations recently where we've talked around this idea that putting people first, it seems to be this big shift in mentality globally for organizations, but there are still some out there who insist on putting profits before people. Uh, what kind of data do you have to back up? Do you have any, and maybe anonymized data that you can share around to creating a better employee experience or creating a happier working environment actually impacts on the bottom line?
So Qualtrics has an organization within Qualtrics called the XM Institute, or the Experience Management Institute. And we've done surveys of organizational leaders, and they found that there's a multiplier effect when organizations really focus on employee experience and customer experience. And when you add the two together, you have this multiplier effect in terms of revenue, profitability, growth. And that all goes back to putting people first. Customers are people too.
Yeah.
Uh, and thinking about what's the impact that you want to have on the world as an organization, and how does that connect back to profitability. The more you can retain good people, the longer they stay with your organization, the better they get at their ability to serve customers. The better they get at their ability to serve customers, the more customer retention and customer loyalty and customer
Mm.
recommendations you'll have.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it, if we're talking about it in a real business sense, it also has to do, with the switching cost, right? If you're in an
Yes.
organization or a business where there's very little competition and the cost of switching is very high, then maybe your people experiences and employee experiences and customer experiences don't have that big of an impact because you kind of have a captive audience. But for the majority of us, we're in a competitive market
Yeah.
where consumers and employees have a choice in terms of where they want to go. And in an environment with rising prices, if you can't or won't compete on wages, or you can't or won't compete on prices, the only thing that you can really compete on is the quality of the experiences that people have. And that's what's going to make the difference between you and the other people that you're competing with in that particular industry.
Now, you use this term impact, and I'm curious about the idea of impact and how much people buy into the impact that the organization has. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but I'm thinking about companies that are perceived to do good in the world versus companies that are maybe they're not doing bad, but they're not kind of actively doing good. Or does that vary? Like, is that perception very subjective? Or is there a difference between the experience of employees in those different types of organizations?
I think it does have an impact on the experience of employees, but there's research on people that have so-called dirty jobs.
Yeah.
People who are debt collectors or people who literally work with garbage or trash collection or work at morgues. And the idea that some jobs aren't doing good in the world, or some jobs or some businesses are in a sense tainted. What we find is that people that in those professions, they tend to think about it in a different way,
Okay.
right? They tend to think about it in terms of, if you think about a defense attorney who represents criminals, right? When you talk to folks in that line of work, they'll tell you that they're here to uphold a system of law and justice, and that
Yeah.
everybody deserves a proper defense, right?
Yeah.
When you talk to,
Interesting that you use that example. I've just started watching How to Get Away with Murder, and that it describes her exactly. She's upholding the law. It doesn't matter whether her client is guilty or not. She's upholding the law, and she's doing the best job that she can on behalf of her client, essentially.
yeah. Or, when you talk to people that are debt collectors that actually enjoy being a debt collector, could you imagine that was one of my first jobs outside of high school. But, being a debt collector, you can look at it as you're strong arming people that are in hard situations for the money that they owe, or you could look at it through the lens of, actually, I'm tough enough to be able to handle this kind of work. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Or people that work at morgues, they might not focus on the fact that they handle dead bodies, but maybe they focus on the fact that they're helping families through a really hard time in their life.
Yeah.
And I work with folks in the energy industry as an example, who really, there's a lot of really well-intentioned people in oil and gas and energy. And, a lot of them really do want to make a positive impact in the world. And despite some of the negative externalities of the work that they do, the world is in its current state powered by the work that they do, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Literally.
yeah. So I think a lot of it is the way that you frame your work and the way that you think. And at the end of the day, no business happens without a customer at the center of it, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's serving a customer, and ideally you're making some sort of an impact on that customer. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that on the surface feels completely altruistic, but there is an impact there.
Yeah. And I did read something recently about that doing good in the world, it doesn't have to be the entire world. It can be the one impact that you have on your one customer, that you made their day better or something like that. In the kind of the context of what you're doing, you don't have to be working for a company that's having this massive impact all over the world. I just thought that was quite an interesting perspective. And thank you for sharing that. The other question, or the other kind of topic that came up there, was if we're not able to compete on wages. And I know this is kind of a hot topic, and especially now, I'm not sure what it's like in the States, Kevin, but certainly here people are being offered 30,000 more to switch roles, and it's a really competitive market at the moment. It's a candidates market. But at the same time, I'm a true believer that it's not about the money. It is more about the experience. Do you have any data that kind of backs that up?
Yeah, I'd say that I'll give you a really interesting example of, sometimes it's not money or experience. I was working with an organization.
Even more interesting.
I was working with an organization that found that they're traditionally underrepresented groups. So at this organization, the majority of employees are white or Asian. And they found that people of color outside of the Asian community had higher employee engagement scores than the majority of the organization. But they were leaving at a higher rate.
Okay, interesting.
And that was really puzzling. Like, why are they leaving? Are they leaving because it's such a competitive market? Are they leaving because the data is inaccurate in some way? Like, perhaps they're not as engaged as they're showing in their employee surveys. Maybe there's something related to inclusion that's aside from employee engagement that's driving this. And when I looked at the data, their exit interview data, as well as their employee engagement data, what we saw was, first of all, you couldn't look at that group of employees as a monolith, right? Because the experience of Latin Hispanic employees and why they left was different from Black folks, was different from women. And what we saw was that for the Hispanic folks that had left, it was the competitive market. They were often going into higher level roles and getting increases in compensation.
Mm.
But for Black folks and women, they were often leaving for things that had nothing to do with employment or money at all. Was childcare responsibilities or family responsibilities, or they wanted to make a career change. So, it is going to be individualized. So I think the more important question is not what's the trend in the market, although that is helpful to put into context.
Yeah.
It's what is it for the particular employee population that is attracted to the kind of employment that we offer, and what's that marketplace look like? What does our specific marketplace of employment look like? What does our talent pool look like? Another example that comes to mind was two healthcare organizations. One was a hospital system, and the other was a medical device company. And the critical employee populations for the hospital system was nurses, and the critical employee population for the medical device company was sales folks. So both of these organizations had assumed different things about the talent pool. The hospital organization assumed that nurses were going to be driven by mission and purpose, and the medical device company assumed that salespeople were going to be driven by compensation.
Yeah. Okay.
And the ability to make money. But actually, it was the opposite. That it was flipped, right? And the reason for that is because nurses are able to find meaning and purpose in any kind of role, right?
Yeah, okay.
That's something ubiquitous within that industry. So the differentiator was actually compensation. Whereas medical device salespeople, these are really, really highly compensated people that can make seven figures in their role. So money was sort of just table stakes. The differentiator was the belief in the product and the mission and purpose and the ability of that product to save lives.
Yeah.
So I think, asking that question of, is it money or purpose? Well, I think it's both, and it's going to be the percentage of the pie, right, is going to be different for each person, but it's also going to be different for each talent pool.
Yeah.
And calibrating according to the talent pool that you're after is going to be more important than getting the overall trend.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes total sense, and it's a really powerful example. I think it's really, really well illustrated in that example. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, we've kind of talked around analytics, but we haven't kind of explained exactly what it is or how people access it. And I have a feeling that in Ireland, for sure, we are behind on this journey. I think the UK are a bit ahead of us. But talk to me about what's going on in the States at the moment in relation to analytics and using analytics to create better working environments for people, for employees.
I think it starts with recognizing that the data is already there.
Yeah.
And it's really about asking questions of that data to help you solve business problems and achieve business goals. So the data that probably already exists within most organizations is the operational data. The number of people that have been hired, the time to fill those roles, the turnover metrics, demographic metrics, anything that sits in your HRIS. So in most organizations, that data is there. It might not be clean. It might not be easily accessible.
There might be in different systems.
Yeah. But I think the table stakes is just, the operational data, you have that. And you can do a lot with that, right? You can say, based upon the source of hire, how long is that person's time to ramp? Based upon the part of the organization that they sit in, there's going to be differences in terms of turnover. And I think that understanding in and of itself can add to a lot of insight that can help you improve the way that your business works. But the thing that's the trend and the future is thinking about not just the operational data that we call at Qualtrics, the O data. It's also connecting the X's and O's. So the X data, that's the experience data, right? So the operational data tells you how many people left your organization. The experience data through employee feedback or listening and scraping information on Indeed or Glassdoor or other social media channels tells you why those people left,
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
experience of leaving is. Um, there's the operational pieces around, did people have their laptop on day one?
Mm,
Were they able to sign
I can
in?
relate.
Right? Can't we all? I mean, I think so many
Yeah.
people have an example of like an onboarding experience that sounded more like waterboarding, right?
Yes.
And if you're
Yeah.
not collecting experience data around that, you might be missing a big piece of the picture around what's happening, right? Because if you're just tracking whether or not the laptop went out, you might not know whether or not that person was able to log in and actually felt empowered to do their job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when you think about the business impact on how long it takes that person to ramp up and whether or not they turn over within the first 6 months or year because their onboarding experience felt like uh, felt like some sort of hazing experience rather
Yes.
than
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
a welcoming
does
environment.
someone have a camera? Is someone secretly filming me here? You know? Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. And yeah, I mean, everything that you're saying, I suppose, around that makes sense. And we spoke before we started recording about this idea of the employee journey. Do you want to talk more about like what are the stages in that employee journey and how can we look at those stages slightly differently and how can we tweak the experience that employees are having at different stages using data?
Yeah, so in my space, a lot of people traditionally and still look at metrics like employee engagement.
Mm,
The degree to which someone intends to stay in their role and the extra discretionary effort that they apply toward their role. Um, and that's usually done through some sort of a point in time survey of the employee population. But that's just that particular point in time, right? If it's the pulse check of how engaged that person happens to be
yeah.
in the moment.
And I
But
would
the
argue that most companies are doing, at the very least, an annual pulse check. Maybe some smaller organizations are not doing that, but, take this as your cue that you need to start doing that at the very minimum is, checking in, finding out what's going on with people. But I'll let you continue. Sorry, Kevin.
No, that's great. But I mean, that's just that, most people are doing that.
Yeah.
But the part that's usually missing is that there's that one point in time. But as you know, your day-to-day experience is going to impact that momentary sense of engagement, either positively or negatively
Yeah.
every day, right? Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
and you think about these moments that matter in the employee journey. Onboarding is one that we talked about, but it starts even before that. What's your experience of finding out about this opportunity, and what's the experience of how you are recruited into the role and hired into the role, and the interviews that you've had. Then we talk about that onboarding experience. Then there's usually some sort of time to ramp experience. And then as you progress throughout your career, your needs are going to change, right? A lot of times in organizations, what we'll see is employee engagement usually follows a U-shaped pattern where new joiners and people that have been there, it's different for every organization. Sometimes the dip happens at 2 years, sometimes it happens at 3 or 4 years, but we typically see very engaged employees early on, and then they become less engaged after a certain point of time. And then we usually see that jump back up. Sometimes it's at 5 years, sometimes it's at 10 years, sometimes it's at 20 years,
Yeah.
right? So there's this other pattern that happens. And what's happening is that after a year or two, people start to grow restless. They want to try new things. They want to either move up or move into a different role. And then you have the experience of going down on leave to care for a child or to care for a family member, or because you're sick. and then returning from leave. And all of these or moving into a management position, right? From an individual contributor position, or moving to a higher leadership position. And all these different points on the employee journey have an impact on other points in the employee journey. So your candidate experience impacts how engaged you're going to be 6 months, a year later.
Yeah.
How engaged you are today as an individual contributor is going to have an impact on how effective you are as a manager. Your onboarding and training as a new manager is going to have a downstream impact on the employee engagement and intent to stay and turnover metrics for your team. So, table stakes is doing that yearly survey.
Yeah.
The next maturity level up from there is to think about this, not just in terms of that point in time, but what are all the different experiences that are happening along the way?
Yeah.
And then the next level up from that is to be able to draw the connections between the different points. And I'll give a real simple illustration of, we worked with a retail client that broke down manager behaviors on day one for new employees. And they could use that information to predict how included and how much people felt like they belonged 6 months later. And in this retail environment, they're onboarding a lot of people that have a ton of turnover. So sometimes the first connection that they have with a new employee is a text message or an email. Sometimes it's over Zoom. Sometimes it is a one-on-one meeting. And what we found is that only Zoom and one-on-one meetings made a difference.
Okay.
If that on that first day, someone had a human-to-human connection, face-to-face connection, whether that's digitally or in person, 6 months later, they felt like they belonged and they felt included in the organization. Any other way of introducing a new employee to their manager led to significantly lower instances of belonging and inclusion.
Okay.
Right. And it's a huge finding, right? But you're not able to find something like that unless you're connecting multiple touch points in the employee journey.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. And I think everything that you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I still have this kind of underlying, like, maybe it's a really simple and basic question, but it makes sense intuitively, but how do you know? And, if I had, let's say, and I'm thinking to specific organizations where I was recruited into, and the experience that I had, I can see how that led me to have the subsequent experiences that I had, let's say, in those roles. But why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah.
Tell me more. Yeah.
Is it, I suppose from my perspective, it's I didn't have the best experience of being recruited. I didn't have the best experience of being onboarded, and subsequently felt less engaged throughout the entire employee journey that I was on.
Yeah. And I think the reason is because humans aren't robots.
Yeah.
I think we the employees have workplace needs that, when met, they give above and beyond. I think most people, and I think the data shows this, most people are good people. Most people are hardworking, want to do a good job. And it's only when those things are absent that people become disempowered. People tend to give less of themselves. And it's really just about making sure that you're doing the care and feeding and stewarding the people that choose to spend their time with your organization.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense intuitively, but I was like, well, but why? There's a lot that I would like to unpack within that. I want to take a step back now and talk about this engagement U-shape. So you're saying it's a U-shape, and that the kind of upward part of the second part of the U, where it goes back up again, could be anything from 2 years, it could be 20 years. But what's driving that? So what's driving the increase in engagement after a long period of time of kind of, disengagement, let's say, or less engagement?
So this was an interesting study that I did for an organization where they noticed that U-shaped curve. And they noticed that one of their key drivers of employee engagement was that sense of career progression.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
As measured by the question, I believe I have great career opportunities at this organization. And you saw that U-shaped curve with that question.
Mm.
And what we found was that after about 2 years, if people got promoted into a new role, that career progression metric jumped up.
Yeah.
And that's like, okay, that's nice to know, but we can't go around giving everybody a promotion.
Yeah.
But another piece of analysis that we did was to look at it and say, okay, well, what about when they don't get promoted, they make a lateral move, but they move into a different role?
Yeah.
And what we see is that for those folks, their career progression metrics jumped up not just as high as the people that got promoted, but even higher.
Hmm.
And we call this the honeymoon effect.
Yeah.
Right. When things are new and novel, you start to see the possibilities, the opportunities for growth. But once you've been there for a while, all those things that are new and novel and exciting, they fall out of the foreground and they go into the background. Right.
Yeah.
When you buy a new car, you have that new car smell.
The new car smell, I was about to say.
Even if
it's all shiny.
Yeah, even if it's a new used car, right? It's
Yeah.
new to you. And you start to notice all the other cars of that brand or that make on the road, and you compare, like, actually mine's a little bit nicer than that one, right? And you have a little bit of a skip in your step as a result of that. But human happiness has this thing called the hedonic treadmill, where when things are new and novel, they tend to impact us. But over time, those things fall into the foreground, right? Like they've done research where people move from the iciest parts of Michigan to the most beautiful parts of California, and vice versa. And in the first few years, the folks that move from Michigan to California love the weather. I think another great example might be like Ireland to Sydney or something, right?
Yes,
but the first few years, it's like you're so much happier because the weather's so much better.
Exactly.
But after about 2 or 3 years, that novelty falls away and other things start to be more important to you. So that's probably what's happening with that U-shaped curve.
Yeah. The other thing that occurred to me as well, Kevin, is that, and I was going to ask when you were saying about, well, it's the progression and people see career progression as something amazing. And I thought, well, it could be that the people who weren't promoted left the organization, and therefore those who were there for longer are the ones who are getting promoted, and therefore that's why it's going up. But I love the explanation as well around, it's not just about promotion, it's about those lateral moves. And I know the importance of lateral moves and novelty and challenge in a role, because if you're doing something for 2 years and there's nothing really left new to learn, that you're getting a bit bored and complacent in what you're doing, there's no real challenge in what you're doing anymore. But when you take on a new role and you have to learn new systems and you have to learn new people and new ways of doing things and new challenges, new problems and issues that you encounter in the role, I think that gives a great sense of kind of refreshment. The other thing I wanted to touch on was this idea of workplace needs. That's something I talk about all the time. I'm hugely interested in this concept of needs. I did my dissertation research as part of my master's in looking at this concept of fit and what drives our sense of fit in an organization. And the kind of primary driver is this values and values alignment, but actually underlying that is our need satisfaction at work. So I love that you kind of brought that up, that we're humans, we're not robots. And actually, as leaders, we need to make sure that our employees' needs are being met at work. And that's our primary role, is to make sure their needs are being met and that they're being developed, essentially. Any thoughts or any ideas around expanding on this concept of needs? Are there particular needs? What I looked at as part of my dissertation were the autonomy, relatedness and competence, but I know there are additional needs that people have in the workplace as well. Do you have any research around that?
Well, so anecdotally, but also from a research perspective, I love the piece around, belongingness, relatedness. That's huge to the extent that we at Qualtrics on employee experience scientist team, sometimes we talk about whether belongingness should be considered part of the engagement index because
Okay.
there's
Yeah.
such a high statistical relationship between the two.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think from a diversity and inclusion perspective, it is useful to think about it as a separate metric,
Yeah.
but it's so related. It's so intertwined. Mastery, I think that's and going back to this idea of fit. Um, Gallup did some research back in 2016 where they asked people to rate what would cause them to think about looking for another job. And this has changed. Wages are much higher on that list now, but at the time, the number one thing was the ability to do what they do best every day, to use their
Yeah.
strength in the role.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there's a dispositional element to that around mastery, but there's also that growth component related to that, right? Around really getting good at what you do, and then autonomy. There's so much depth to that piece of autonomy,
Mm.
and going back to self-determination theory, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you tend to think about autonomous motivation as some people think about it in terms of black or white, right? Like it's either
Mm.
extrinsic or intrinsic,
Yeah.
but there's that middle piece around identified motivation, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, I'm doing this because it's good for me. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing this because I feel like it's the right thing to do and it's part of my values, as you mentioned, values, right?
Mm.
And I think that identified motivation is an underutilized part of the employee experience when it comes to things like goal setting and motivation and even onboarding, right? Are you giving goals to the employee,
Yeah.
or are you co-creating goals
Yes.
with the
Yeah. Yeah.
employee?
Yeah.
And that can really tap into that basic psychological need of autonomy and mastery and belongingness, right? Because it's a cooperative conversation.
Yeah.
You can identify personal growth goals within that conversation,
Yeah.
and you're expressing your sense of autonomy by virtue of co-creating those goals.
Yeah. 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 No, really interesting. The other aspect I wanted to pick up on and I wanted to get your thoughts on, you mentioned that most people are hardworking and want to do a good job. Now, that's something that I believe. However, I've been challenged on that recently where people say to me, I'm not sure that everyone is like that, that there are some people who are kind of coasting, they want to get away with not doing very much work, or they're not motivated by hard work, things like that. Do you have any data around that, or do you have any kind of personal thoughts or anecdotes to share around that?
It's one of the oldest findings in organizational psychology, um, and it's theory X and theory Y.
Hmm.
So I can't answer the question of are people fundamentally good or bad. I think that's
Yeah.
more of it's less of an empirical argument and more of a philosophical discussion, or maybe even theological, depending on your orientation. But
Yeah.
I think the idea of whether managers and leaders believe that people are fundamentally good or fundamentally bad,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
clear impact on people's performance.
Yeah.
And managers that believe theory Y, I forget which is which, so
Yeah.
forgive me if I'm wrong, but theory X managers believe that people are fundamentally lazy and don't want to do
Mm.
their best.
And they need
Uh,
to use the stick to get them to do stuff.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And theory Y managers believe that people are fundamentally self-motivated and
Mm.
responsible. Um, and there's also this thing that they call the Pygmalion effect. There was some research done on the Israeli military where they told a group of generals that were intaking a new class of cadets that they were working with an exceptionally high performing group of people that had been specifically selected based upon their aptitude to be excellent soldiers.
Mm.
And they told another group of generals working with another group of cadets that these folks are just about average.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the high performing, highly selected group outperformed the other group. The only thing is that they were randomly assigned to the two
Yeah.
groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so there's, the expectations that you have of how people are and how they're going to behave changes the way that you approach and speak with them and deal with them in subtle ways that will have a big impact. So I guess this is interesting as a, someone who calls himself a scientist to say, but whether or not people are good or bad matters less than the mindset of whether or not you fundamentally believe people are good or bad.
Yeah. So whether and as a manager, how you behave based on those beliefs that you have about the people who are working with you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Love that. Love that. Um, Now, again, before we started recording, we touched on this idea of using employee experience data to have more actionable outcomes in organizations. Do you have any examples that you'd like to share that we haven't already touched on during our conversation?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. So I recently published an article with the XM Institute on taking action on employee experience data, and the argument is that acting on this data is actually as easy as A, B, C,
Hmm.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, love it.
So A stands for action oriented,
Yeah.
B stands for business relevant, and C stands for conversation based. So it begins with that A around action orientation. And that starts with the way that you collect the data and the reason that you have behind collecting the data and being intentional about the reason behind you collect the data. It can go back to things as simple as what questions you ask on an employee engagement survey.
Yeah.
A lot of times people ask outcome questions like, I feel like I belong at work, I go above and beyond in my job. And those are all great questions to have, but you also want to ask actionable questions. Like, do I have the tools and equipment I need to be successful? Do
Mm.
I know what's expected of me at work?
Yeah.
And put as much emphasis on acting on the information as you do on collecting and fielding the information. There's organizations that have all these tools and tricks that they use to drive participation rate, but they don't put those same tools in place when it comes to finding out whether or not people have taken action on the information. So I think that's part of it, that action orientation piece. The other piece is making it business relevant, right? Are you asking questions because they're interesting to people like us who live in HR and people analytics and data science, or are you asking questions that are relevant to the business? What's the burning platform that you have going on at the business that people data can help you make decisions around? One great example is I'm working with a quick service restaurant that wants to go from 4,000 locations to 7,000 locations. Well, turns out that of their 4,000 locations, only about 50% of their location managers feel fully equipped to be managers. So if they're gonna beef that up to almost doubling in a short period of time, they're gonna have to think about what they're gonna do to train and enable managers, right? And even though we all intuitively know, as you said, we all intuitively know that these things connect, you can never over communicate that to your frontline people because a retail manager, a store manager, they're thinking about how do I make sure I have enough people staffed to operate the floor today, right?
Mm.
How do I deal with that person that just quit the other day? How do I deal with this angry customer? So
Yeah.
the more that we can help them connect the dots between the data and the outcomes, the better it will be for them. So business relevant. And then C, conversation based or conversation driven. A lot of times well-intentioned leaders, HR people, analytics folks will take the data and go to the drawing board in the corner by themselves and analyze everything to the nth degree, and then come back with an action plan that they then dictate to the organization.
Yeah.
But it's better to co-create that plan
Mm.
in a conversation-based way. So that, I love how many people like they have a finding in their data and they're like, okay, well now we want to run focus groups to understand what's happening behind here, which isn't a bad thing, but it's like, okay, well, how about you call that focus group an action planning session, and you have every manager have that conversation with their team.
Yeah.
Conversation based. So that's the ABC. And then the 1, 2, 3 covers communication. I think in the rush to try and do all the things, we can really dilute the impact of the effort that we have. So what data can really provide for us is the gift of focus. Of all the good things that we know we ought to do, what direction is the data pointing us into to say that of all the things that we could do, this is where there seems to be a relationship there.
Yeah.
And why not act on that one thing? Better to act on one thing and put all of your effort into it than to try to do all the things. So act on one area, two things about it, because you don't necessarily know what's going to work. Maybe you even try an A/B test, but act on one thing, do two things about it, and communicate what you've done 3 times through 3 different channels. So not everybody looks at Slack, not everybody looks at Microsoft Teams, not everybody looks at emails, not everybody pays attention during team meetings. So you have to have multiple channels of communication, because oftentimes there's a lot of work that well-intentioned HR folks are doing that is connected back to people analytics and employee data, but they never communicate that that's the reason why they're doing those things.
Yeah.
Or they do communicate it, but it gets lost in the noise, right?
Yeah,
so as many times as you can repeat like a drum, we heard you all say X.
Yes.
Therefore, we are doing Y.
Yeah. I was about to say, because oftentimes the difficulty is that we ask questions, but it seems like we've asked the questions for no reason whatsoever, because the people who answered those questions don't see the results of the questions that were asked. There's no direct link made between, okay, so you said, we asked you these questions and now here's the answer based on, or here's a conversation to, exactly as you said, co-create the answer based on the data as it came back, and trying to kind of dive into that a little bit more. Oftentimes I think we're guilty of asking the question but not actually sharing the results.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think
or doing nothing about it at all, just asking the question for the sake of asking the question.
Yeah. If you're going to ask the question just for the sake of asking the question, don't ask the question. Right?
Exactly. It's a waste of everyone's time.
Yeah. Especially, it's like the classic example is if you don't intend to raise wages, don't ask people about their satisfaction with wages.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that would just annoy them if you say, everyone says that the wages are way too low, but we're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
How's the temperature in here? Actually, it's kind of cold. Oh, well, that's too bad. I can't change the thermostat. It's broken.
Don't go down that road. Personal experience with that as well, and measurement of the temperature, and let's leave it the temperature, and people sneakily changing the temperature, and it's a huge bone of contention, I think, especially now with people going back into office working. It's so funny. It's going to rear its ugly head again. I know it is.
So funny, early on when there was this exodus of people from the office to working from home, there was a transition period where the technology wasn't quite there. And now that people are going back into the office, there's also that transition period where people aren't used to using the conference room technology. And it's just funny how it's changed so much. I
can't remember how to turn on the lights or all of that kind of stuff. Now it's interesting what you're saying about co-creating the action plan. I was involved in that in the last organization I worked in. We did the Gallup Q12 survey, and exactly that. We took the results, but we created teams of manager-led teams to talk about what the results were and what we individually as a team could do differently based on the results at the lowest level that we could go down to. Essentially, so it was really interesting for us to actually be creating those solutions for ourselves. I think that was really empowering for us, for sure.
Yeah, it is, and it can happen so much more quickly than the organizational changes, right? If you think about like we call it at the XM Institute the different loops, right? So there's that inner loop, which is the team loop. And then there's the outermost loop, which is the organizational processes and policies. And, there's organizations that overemphasize one versus the other. I love the manager-oriented action planning, and it's part of my DNA as a former Gallup employee. And I also recognize that sometimes there are systemic issues that can only be handled by the uppermost leadership within the organization. You can only make the most impact by driving both at the same time. And then there's the inner loops that are more like, specific product or experience owners, right? Like who's like the talent acquisition team for candidate experience, or the onboarding team, if you have one, for the onboarding experience, things like that.
Yeah. No, I love that. I'm also conscious that if people are getting started with this type of approach for the first time, any thoughts to share on what they might do just to get started? You know, if they're kind of new to this whole people analytics thing, what might they start by doing?
Do a baseline survey.
Mm.
Use good technology to collect it. I work for Qualtrics, so obviously I'm going to promote Qualtrics.
Hashtag hashtag
Um,
recommend Qualtrics.
and then use a pre-validated survey methodology, or hire someone like me, or someone who has a depth of survey design to design the survey for you, um, because they will help you do things like ask actionable questions.
Yeah.
They'll help you vet the questions to give yourself, um, to answer that hard question of, do we really want to ask this? Is this something that we're really prepared to act on?
Yeah.
And make sure that you design with the end in mind. So going back to that action orientation piece, what's the action that we're going to take when we get these results back? Plan for that and build that into your project plan. And I think that's the first place, is to do that kind of baseline. That first survey might actually be longer than you would normally do, because you're not going to know exactly what's important to your people just yet. So you might want to test out a lot of different theories around what that is. And then based upon the results of that, you'll start to learn what other listening touch points you might want to add. So if you see within that data there's something going on with manager effectiveness, well, maybe you want to add another listening touch point around your manager training programs. If you see within that there's an indication that something might be happening on the onboarding side, well, then maybe you want to add another listening touch point on the onboarding side. But that baseline will start to give you an initial understanding of where you want to focus and where you want to go next.
Yeah. Love that. I think it's straightforward, and it's really practical for people to start doing that straight away. Is there anything else that you would like to share, Kevin, before we start wrapping things up?
No, I just say, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love to connect with people in this space. And check out my most recent blog article on the XM Institute around acting on employee experience data. You just look me up,
Great.
Kevin E. Campbell. The G often helps. Because
Yes.
it's
Yeah. A common name. Brilliant. And we can link to that article in the show notes as well. So keep an eye out for that. Now, Kevin, one of the questions that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does being happier at work mean to you?
Yeah, so I love that question. And Ed Diener is kind of the forefather of positive psychology and the measurement of happiness. And he used an instrument called subjective well-being for measuring happiness. And it has three components. It has your day-to-day moods and emotions that are considered positive, your day-to-day moods and emotions that are considered negative. So positive ones are things like exhilaration, laughter, interest, excitement. Negative ones are things like boredom and sadness. So there's those two components: positive emotions, negative emotions. And then the third component is life satisfaction. So how satisfied with your life? Have you accomplished the things that you've set out to accomplish? And together, these three components make up happiness, right? So high positive emotions, low negative emotions, and high life satisfaction. But for all of us, you can be any combination of those three things. So you can have high positive and high negative emotions, which means that you're all over the place, along with high or low life satisfaction, right? You can have really high life satisfaction and have low positive emotions and low negative emotions and be just kind of flat. And I think for each of us, we have different weightings in terms of what's most important to us. Okay. Is happiness to us being not sad? Is happiness to us having a lot of positive emotions? Or is happiness with us having a really high appraisal of how we're doing in one's life? And for me personally, I like to have a good balance of all three.
Yeah.
I like to accomplish what I set out to do in life. And I'd like to do that while maximizing my positive emotions and minimizing my negative emotions where possible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
At work,
But
it's all those things.
yes, yeah, yeah. You just put those in. And I'm wondering, kind of follow on question to that, does that change throughout life as well? So if you're saying it's maybe different for different people, the weighting that we give each of those, but perhaps it changes throughout our lives as well, the emphasis that we put on each of those things. Maybe early in our life there's less focus on the life accomplishments because you have fewer of those.
I think I don't know, but I
Mm.
think there is some data that would suggest that. So one example is there's some interesting research that's come out of German data that has showed that new parents, especially women, have a decrease in subjective well-being after having kids.
Okay,
Uh,
interesting.
but if you ask most people, the overwhelming majority of us who are parents, and I'm a new parent, I have a 9-month old daughter. I mean, yeah, maybe I do experience a little bit more grumpiness from time to time. But man, I wouldn't trade any of that for my daughter.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I do think there are different components that get emphasized at different life stages, and I
Okay,
think
yeah,
the
yeah.
same is for employees, right?
Yeah.
Different points in your career, different things are going to be important to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. There was lots of different directions that we could have gone today, but I think we ended up with really, really practical tips for people to take away and really make a difference to their employees' working experience, I think. So I appreciate everything that you shared and thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye bye.